Well, good morning and welcome to Bible Study. So glad that you are here with us this morning for another day as we continue on through PartyOn, looking at food and fellowship, feasts, all the places in the Bible where the Jewish people especially are having fun, and hopefully that will be an example to us as well. Now, this week in particular, as we walk through this study, we are looking at the Jewish festivals. And one of the amazing things that I've found in this week-long study that we're still in about the Jewish festivals is that God is continually encouraging his people to pause from their normal workday activities, from their normal lives, and to take some time out to celebrate. And in order to ensure that they do that, he gives them very specific instructions as to how to celebrate, and also gives them very specific instructions about the timing, and that these things are supposed to be perpetual, that they're supposed to be celebrations year after year after year, in case they get the idea that God just said that we should do this thing one time. And so it begins to be this routine, kind of like, I guess, here in the United States, you've got Memorial Day and July 4th and Labor Day, and then, Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas. So you have kind of this calendar of celebrations that you kind of mark time by throughout the year, except rather than these being celebrations that have to do with other things, all of these ways in which God is encouraging them to mark the year are religious or spiritual in nature. And so it kind of becomes this rhythm throughout their year that continually reminds them of God and continually reminds them to recenter themselves. And it's great that it's not necessarily worship services that God is using to create the rhythm throughout their year. It's celebrations, it's partying, it's coming together for food and feasting and fellowshipping. And obviously, as a part of that, it becomes a reminder that all good things, even celebrations and parties, come from God. So why don't we go ahead and open to Leviticus chapter 23. All of this is brought today by Christ's Table. Thank you to all of you who are part of giving to that ministry, and would love to have you a part of what we're doing. So go ahead, and if you've not already done so, visit christtable.today. Make sure to sign up for the email list, because I've got one going out here in just a couple of days to update you on all the stuff that's happening in June, and there is a lot to tell you about. Here we go. Leviticus chapter 23, verse 15. Now, you're going to begin, if you've been with us through the study, to see some recurring themes throughout each of these festivals that God has called the Jewish people to mark time by. But each of them also are unique in their own way as well. So be looking for those things. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you bring the bundle of grain to be lifted up as a special offering, count off 7 full weeks. And so this is referring back to the celebration that we spoke about yesterday, which was the Feast of First Fruits. And so that's what it means whenever it says, whenever you bring the bundle of grain to be lifted up, what I want you to do, God says, is I want you to count off 7 full weeks after that. And so this ends up kind of becoming referred to as the Festival of Weeks, because God marks the time period as to when it should be celebrated. And that's 7 weeks after you first begin the harvest. Keep counting until the day after the 7th Sabbath, which is 50 days later. 50 in the Bible also means Pentecost. And so an exact translation of 50 is Pentecost. So sometimes this is called the Festival of Weeks, referring to 7 weeks, or sometimes this is called the Festival. In the New Testament, you'll see this. It's called the Festival of Pentecost because of that 50-day marker, by the way that they count the time. Then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. So this one still has to do with harvest, just like yesterday's Festival of First Fruits does as well. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves of bread to be lifted up before the Lord as a special offering. And so this Festival of First Fruits that we talked about yesterday was at the beginning of the barley and the wheat harvest. This one, 7 weeks later, is now at the end of the harvest of all of the wheat. And so God is saying, now on the flip side of the harvest, I want you to have another celebration. And certainly there was a lot to celebrate after finishing the harvest, all of that work, all of that time, all of that blood, sweat, and tears that goes into harvesting. God says, now that you've got everything brought in from the fields, it's a really good time to stop and celebrate again. And when you celebrate, because you're going to do it anyway, probably, when you celebrate the completion of this, what I want you to do is I want you to take some of the crops from there. I want you to bake a couple of loaves of bread, and I want you to symbolically lift them up before the Lord as a special offering. Now, we do this as well. Many of you who, on your first year anniversary at an employer, what do? You go and you celebrate. Maybe you mark anniversaries, 5 years, 10 years. For those of you who work contract jobs or short-term jobs, you'll give a few months, you'll give a few years to a project or something, and when that's done, there's a capstone. There's a celebration oftentimes at the end, even if it's just with you and the guys, or with you and the girls, or with your friends or co-workers. This is God simply saying, I know that you're going to have a celebration of this, but during that celebration, I want you to not be so self-focused during your celebration at the end of harvest, after the end of bringing all of this in. I want you to remember me. Remember that word. Remember is something that is always being proclaimed in the Bible towards God. Biggest problem that you can have in life from the Bible's perspective is to fail to remember God in your journey through life. The greatest success and the biggest reminder that the Bible has for us in living a spiritually centered life is to simply remember. So many problems are solved whenever we simply remember, even in our own life. Simply remember your anniversary. Simply remember your birthday. Simply remember to stay in contact with those people who love you and have helped you. Remembering solves a whole lot of problems, not just in the physical world, but also in the spiritual world as well. So God calls them now at the end of the harvest to bring these 2 loaves of bread together, and he asks them to lift them up before the Lord as a special offering. Make these loaves, and gives very specific instructions here, because that was Moses' way. That was God's way. I'm going to tell you exactly the way that I want you to do it. Just so that you don't get off the rails, I guess. Make these loaves from 4 quarts of choice flour. I don't want you using the flour from the wheat that's second best, third best, fourth best. I want you to do this right, and I want you to do this well. Bake them with yeast. Now, Passover and that first festival that we talked about, which is the Festival of Unleavened Bread, those were without yeast. This time, God says, I want you to make the best bread that you can, so use yeast. They will be an offering to the Lord from the first of your crops. Along with the bread, present 7 one-year-old male lambs with no defects, 1 bull, and 2 rams as a burnt offering to the Lord. And this would have been food that ended up being for their feast. It also would have been food that would have ended up going to the priests and to the temple workers who had no land. And so these sacrifices end up really simply being a way to sustain not just the celebrations, but to sustain the religious workers who help lead them in these things. And so this is part of the reason why we continue to see God placing these requirements as well, these requests on them to bring animals and things to sacrifice so that there would be food. Obviously, God is saying as well, there is a religious context to these sacrifices as well. It is a reminder to you that all of this has come from me. All of this has been given to you by me. Everything that you have, not just 10%, but all of it has been given to you by me. So these burnt offerings, together with the grain offerings and the liquid offerings, will be a special gift. And we have heard this language before, a pleasing aroma to the Lord. It smells good. The smell of the baking bread, the smell of this food that is being sacrificed and essentially cooked as a burnt offering on the altar, and which will soon be consumed as well. It smells good to God. I'm not so sure, though, that it's as much the actual smell of the burning meat and the baking loaves of bread and the liquid offerings. I think it is the fact that they're remembering him. It smells good. It makes them smile. Then you must offer one male goat as a sin offering. So God's reminding them, you need to remember that you're not perfect, and there have been moments where you've stumbled and where you've failed, and you need to seek forgiveness for those, absolution for those things. 2 one-year-old male lambs as a peace offering. The priest will lift up the 2 lambs as a special offering to the Lord, together with the loaves representing the first of your crops. These offerings, which are holy to the Lord, here it is, belong to the priests. That same day will be proclaimed an official day for Holy Assembly, a day on which you do no ordinary work. And so remember, as we've said, we kind of see 2 things happening with these festivals. There is both an assembly and there is also a celebration. So there's an opportunity for them to gather together and remember, do something spiritual in practice, and then also do something physical in eating in practice. And so in these festivals, God kind of ties these 2 things together, the assembly and the feast. This is a permanent law for you. Here it is. It is something that you're going to do each and every year. So just get used to this rhythm, and it must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. Whether you're living at home, whether you're living in a different town than you grew up, whether or not anybody else participates in it, or even if you're not in country, if you're somewhere else, you're still supposed to celebrate this, God says to the Jewish people. Now, I actually, as I was inserting these graphics, stopped here, but this is not the end of this reading in this passage, because it feels like there's an ending here. It's a permanent law for you. It must be observed from generation to generation wherever you live. And the other festivals, this is essentially kind of the bookend, the ending. But I missed that this is a false ending. It's not the end of this passage of text that is talking about this festival. There's still one more thing to say, and it's so interesting to me that it comes after this line, but here it is. When you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your field. Do not pick up what the harvesters drop. Leave it for the poor and the foreigners living among you. I'm the Lord your God. And here is the end. And so at first I kind of thought, well, this feels a bit like an afterthought. Maybe God forgot to include this in there. Maybe a scribe or somebody added it later. Doesn't really seem likely that that's the case. And then I thought, one of the things that I know from my communications background is there are 2 things in emails and in letters that people read first. Usually, especially in letters, in a printed letter that you get in the mail, whenever you used to get those in snail mail. They'll read usually the first paragraph, and they'll read the PS down at the bottom, below the signature, the postal script. Oftentimes, that is the first thing that people's eyes and interest will jump to, is the PS at the bottom. Lots of studies have been done on this. And so the most important part of a letter is the PS, usually, because it's both the last thing that you leave people with, and it's also oftentimes the first thing that people end up seeing or noticing, and it also ends up being usually the thing that they remember most from the letter. And that is kind of essentially, I think, what God has done here, is God has given a PS that's going to be the last thing that they're going to remember. The fact that he has ordered it after the official closing also gives it a whole lot more weight, and it may be the most important part of this entire Festival of Weeks. Now, extra credit, one book in the Old Testament, actually the entire story of that book centers around the practice of this verse. Do you know what it is? I'll give you 5 seconds. You know what? The book of Ruth. The book of Ruth hinges around this very practice right here. And so it is something that they continue to do perpetually, generation after generation, because we see it show up in the book of Ruth as well. For me, this really points out, again, a reminder to us of the heart of God, that in our celebration, in our partying, and certainly in our worship and our assembly as well, which is a part of these festivals, God is always looking out for those people who don't have the resources that they need in which to live. The poor, the under-resourced, oftentimes, especially in those days, widows and orphans, people who had no family or had no male in the family in a very patriarchal society. It was nearly, if not completely, impossible to survive unless there was a working man in the family, which is sad. And again, this is part of the story of the book of Ruth as well. Is amazing what happens and the way God views women here, because it's kind of a broken system in a way, but it is the way that it is. And God is continuing to encourage them in these moments to take care of people who are unable to fully take care of themselves. And so one of the things that we can glean from this is God truly also, I believe, one of his core values is for us as well to ensure that we are taking care of those around us with our resources, not just with our excess, but with our resources as well, those people who have need. This is, that passage that we read in 1 Corinthians 11 at every single Lord's Supper, where we get the text, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. This is the cup, and we run through that routine. In the middle of that chapter where we get that passage from, Paul is taking to task the church in Corinth for not, in the midst of their meetings, taking care and feeding those people who don't have enough. They were being stingy. God says, don't be stingy. Don't do that. That's not the way. And that would be a good reminder for us as well. So a few things out of this festival. First of all, they were commanded to acknowledge that the Lord had provided. And I think that is something that we don't want to skip over in this. That moment where they are said to take some of the best and first flour that comes from that 7-week harvest, bake a couple of loaves of bread, and in front of God and everybody, wherever you live, lift those things up as a special offering to the Lord. When you're baking that bread, when you're choosing the best flour, when you are going to the place where you're going to have the feast or where the festival is to be held, and you're lifting those things up, it's a reminder to you every step of the way that even though blood, sweat, and tears from you was a part of harvesting and producing those loaves of bread, ultimately it was God who provided all of those things. Your health to be able to do it, who enabled you to be able to have the land in order to plant it on, who gave you the ability to harvest it, to bake it. All of these things really or truly are gifts from God. And so it's a centering experience. And I can imagine at this Festival of the Weeks, so they have come together for the assembly, the convocation. God says it's a holy order. You take this one day off of work so that you're able to celebrate and remember. And I just imagine this flood of multitudes of Jewish people who have brought together 2 loaves of bread each. And in this moment, they're all holding these pieces of bread up in mass as a reminder to them and to each other that everything that they have, everything that the community has been provided by God. So, well, let me go back to that first. What way in which do you do that? Now, maybe you don't bake bread and hold it up at every meal. Maybe you pray at every meal. Maybe you don't. I don't know that that's right or wrong if you do or if you don't. But I would say that there needs to be some way in which you acknowledge to yourself, to your kids, to your family, that God has provided for you. Also, now I've already previewed this for you, but here you go. Get so focused on your duties don't get so focused on your duties that you neglect human beings in need. Do not get so focused on your duties that you neglect human beings in need. God says, I know that the harvest is a busy time. It's probably the busiest time of your year. The last thing that you're going to be worried about is other people, because you're worried about the crops, making sure that they get harvested, that they get harvested well, and that they get taken care of, that you don't lose any more than is necessary in the harvesting process. Because I don't want you to get so caught up in the reaping and in the storing and in the process of these things that you neglect human beings in need. And that's something that we still do as well. It's not as though we don't care, but it's that we don't remember that there are people out there who are not blessed with tables, who are not blessed with tables filled with food, who are not blessed with other members of the family who are working to help provide or to help produce what goes on that table. We get wrapped up in this as well. And God says, here it is, that word again, remember. Don't just remember God, but I want to make sure God says that you also remember other people. And not just remember, but remembering is the key, the first step to the second step, which is actually doing something about it. For them, it was leaving grain behind so that people could come in and thieve the grain with a holy sanction from God, because it was left over. And what we see in this passage as well, I think, is not just care of others, but eventually the New Testament is we also have to remember Christ. And, Christ has been wrapped up in each and every one of these festivals. The first one, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, a week-long festival. Jesus, actually the triumphal entry occurs at the very beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Then obviously the Passover, whenever Jesus is crucified, and the Passover and the first lamb, the spotless, unblemished, perfect lamb, tie in with Jesus. Then we talked yesterday about the Feast of First Fruits, which essentially also happens on the same day that Jesus raised from the dead, and how there is a connection there from the Feast of First Fruits and that celebration and the history of that to Jesus and his resurrection being the first fruit as well of something new. And here now again today, in the fourth festival that we've talked through, Jewish festivals, the Festival of Weeks, or the Festival of Pentecost, this is the day that the Holy Spirit is sent. God said, I want you to wait around in Jerusalem, or Jesus said, I want you to wait around in Jerusalem until something happens. And so the day that the Holy Spirit comes, the day that the church is started, is also on the celebration of this harvest. And there is a very important connection there. I don't think that you can say that these things are accidental, that now 4 of these Jewish festivals, Feast of Unleavened Bread, Passover, Feast of First Fruits, and now the Feast of Weeks, or the Feast of Pentecost, that all 4 of these things are directly tied to an event in Jesus' journey as well. There's something to that. And that's something that really, I think, needs to be wrestled with. But that's all the time that I have for today. In fact, I've taken too much of it. So until tomorrow.